Hey guys, how's it going? Welcome to campaign diary number 6. I believe I mislabeled the last one during the video as number 6 when it was actually number 5. This is actually campaign diary number 6 here. And just as a warning, I've been using scripts for the other campaign diaries. We're going to try to do this one unscripted, so a little more kind of off the cuff, if you will. So let's go ahead and hop right into it. Where last we left off, our group of adventurers, or pirates, or whatever you want to call them, had been taken captive after the heist that they had completed turned out to be somewhat of a setup in order to capture and then kill their previous captain, Bort the Butcher. The players have gotten to know their situation and their captors. They have on one side the Vellecan soldier, lieutenant, whatever you want to call them, Zanobi il Pazzo, right, which means Zenobi the Mad One, or the Insane. And on the other side, they have Mirix, the Elven Pirate, a fairly notorious pirate who had a grudge to settle with Bort the Butcher. These two factions both have many of their men supporting them, and they have a little armada, a little flotilla, I guess, of around 10 ships. The players have gotten to realize that these crews don't really mesh well. These human Vellecan soldiers, mostly humans, and these mostly elven pirates don't really get along very well. They also know that the new moon is coming up in a few days, and they've been given an amulet. Cyrus, specifically, the shadow sorcerer of the group, has been given an amulet, and he was told by the person who gave it to him, which I covered in a previous campaign diary, he had been told that on the next new moon he may have use of this amulet. And I described last session how he could feel the power kind of accumulating as the new moon, a new moon cycle was approaching. And so the players and we kind of went over this last session, but the players, their characters are brought up to the top deck, to the castle, where there has been tables set up for what is going to be a feast. Basically, both the captain of the vessel, Zenobi, and the elven pirate, Mirix, want to treat their prisoners with respect because they kind of been trying to recruit them, both of them. As the players are brought up here and are waiting for their hosts, they see the hosts basically start fighting and arguing on the deck below. As they argue, Zenobi lets slip in a moment of anger, and he's called the crazy for, the insane for a good reason. In a moment of anger, he lets slip the fact that they were never going to pay the elves anyways. And this leads to an immediate fight. The whole crew of both sides starts to just clash and fight. I describe how on other ships too, the other elves and the other human soldiers start to realize the deal is up. We are now basically at war with each other. And they start fighting, so it's chaos on multiple vessels that are sharing crews, some of which are more lopsided than others. And this is basically where we left off the last campaign diary, and this last session. The only other thing that happened, and something that will definitely turn the tides in favor of the players, is that as they realize this is their chance to break free, Cyrus gets himself to a safe position surrounded by these senior officers of the crew, and he begins to use this amulet and instinctively knows how to draw down the power of the moon. And these dark beams of energy, similar to a moonbeam, but dark because it's a new moon, start to just cut through swaths of enemies. It's almost like laser beams, like literally, that disintegrate essentially all the enemies in its path. And it starts slicing apart the crew on top of the both of these enemy crews, on top of the ship they're on and on top of other ships. And that's basically where we left off. I think the last thing I said in the last campaign diary, and the last thing I said in that session, is that as this fighting is beginning in earnest, and the players are going to have to fight for either escape or perhaps to take control of the ship, they're not sure which, they see off in the distance, heading this way, is a galley, a ramming-focused war galley, Vellecan galley, coming to this ship. Apparently, whoever's captaining that ship has decided that destroying this ship that they were going to give to the elves would be better than letting the elves take it. And that is where we left off. all that being said, this is where we picked up the next session. Basically, we had to stop there. It was getting too late. And we started right when this fighting is starting. And essentially, we rolled into initiative, and I told the players, and this is a recurring theme for a lot of sea battles in this campaign, and how I will be doing sea battles in the future. I told the players that there are too many crew members from all three sides here, right? The Vellecans, the elves, and then their crew. Their crew, most of their crew isn't on the ship, just their senior officers. But even that is around 10 people, 4 of which are their characters, but then there's also some other senior officers, the surgeon, the cook, etc. And these are NPCs or backup characters. And I told them there's no way we're going to run combat for everything here. So essentially what I've done, and what I will keep doing, is in situations like this, I'm not going to represent anything except for the parts of the combat that will be focusing on the players. Essentially, I told the players, the rest of the battle will be going on. Your officers versus these 2 crews that are all fighting each other. But as long as you can win your battle against the enemy officers here, Mirix and Zenobi, and a couple of their supporters and bodyguards who are directly supporting them, if you can defeat them, then you will win the battle overall, right? And so it's kind of an abstracted way of doing it. And so we roll into initiative, and they're fighting, I think maybe it was like 5 or 6 different normal crewmen who have some ranged weapons and stuff to challenge the players with, and also Mirix and Zenobi. I believe I made Mirix, I'm remembering now, a blade bard. I don't remember the name exactly, but that was interesting. So basically they're swift with a blade and kind of use their blade as almost a musical focus. And I kind of like that, a very elegant sort of dance-like way of dancing through combat, right? And on the other hand, Zenobi, I think I made just some sort of I based him off of a fighter or some type of martial class. However, there's a few things that kind of make the combat a little more interesting right off the bat. The players are up in this castle, and when Zenobi and Mirix start to realize that the players are taking control of the ship, they actually put aside their own combat, and they both start focusing on the players. Obviously, the main reason for this is just because, out of character, I didn't want the players to be unchallenged and the enemies to kill each other, right? I want the players to challenge, or the enemies to challenge the players, right? And so Zenobi and Mirix start running up these parallel stairs on either side of the deck to get to them. At about this point in time, though, I think they shoot something at Zenobi and maybe hit him. But after he's hit, and after he is sort of introduced into the combat itself, though, I describe how he takes off into flight. Literally, wings. I don't remember how I described them. I think I described them as maybe like griffin-looking wings or big eagle wings or something. Literally sprout from his back. And he starts flapping around with relative ease. And I let one of the player characters, Nihilus, who is trained to identify artifacts and tomes and ancient knowledge, I had him make a check, and he actually was able to recognize that this is an artifact. This is not just a normal item that lets you fly, and it's not like he actually has wings. What this guy has are called the Wings of Calendon, which is a religiously associated item in my world. And so the fact that this it's not a major artifact, but like a minor artifact, but a unique artifact, right? There's only one of it. The fact that this is here definitely brings the stakes up. The players realize already they're dealing with some pretty powerful forces. And so he starts flying around, and the way I describe Zenobi, I remember, he was a rogue, because the way I describe him is basically he has 2-hand crossbows, and he basically is going like reloading them and then shooting. Almost as if, I'm thinking more of like in video games when you have 2 pistols and they kind of like real quick reload each, right? And he starts flying around shooting these hand crossbows. Meanwhile, Mirix tries to run up the stairs at the player, and here is a really genius use of a spell from Watna, the artificer, and because of the fact that that Jack, who plays Watna, plays him as a non-magical character in the sense that, his artificer stuff is more alchemy than magic. The way he described it, the spell was, I don't remember if it's called slime, no, it's grease. but basically you spawn a section of grease that basically makes the ground very slippery. And he put this he described that he basically threw a flask of grease or something like this. And Watna, the artificer, basically spreads this grease at the top of the stairs that Mirix is running up. And so what I describe is that as Mirix and one of his soldiers are running up the stairs, they slip and fall. They have to make a check. They both failed. And I describe that this isn't part of the spell. I think normally they just go prone. But I decided they're on a staircase on a boat and they just slipped. I think they're going to slide back down the stairs and bonk their head, taking just a little bit of damage. And so I described this. And this actually turned out to have a huge role in the combat, because even though as mundane as it is to just grease the top of the stairs, from this point on, Mirix, I think, didn't even make it up the stairs. He just kept falling, and it was very comical and annoying for me, but at the same time hilarious and obviously great. And I think I even gave inspiration for this later, because I thought it was just a very clever use of the spell. Meanwhile, as this is going on, Zenobi is kind of like flying around underneath like the little dinghy to hide and reload and then pop out, get like a sneak attack shot or an unseen attacker shot, right? And he's just being a very sneaky and a nuisance when he is attacking them. The players are still hitting him, though. They're hitting him back with different spells, with different crossbow attacks or whatever it might be. And finally, Zenobi realizes that he has to go. I think he did the most damage to Verdin, the paladin of the group. And Zenobi realizes that eventually he has to go. And at this point, Zenobi turns to basically just fly off into the night. Verdin is very beat up, but has a little bit of health. And he hasn't used his Channel Divinity. And with his Channel Divinity, what he chooses to do, he uses his special one. I don't remember if this came... I think he switched subclasses at some point, switched his oath. But it allowed him to basically make it so that any enemy of his choice within a certain range cannot go out of this range. Basically, he's challenging all the enemies near him, and they can't leave until they've challenged him back or, beaten him. And it works. It has a saving throw, but Zenobi fails it. So Zenobi is bound to this area temporarily. And a couple other enemies are too. Verdin, I believe, is using like a halberd and is swinging it around wildly. It's a crazy combat. Again, Mirix still has been pretty ineffective, so the players aren't too worried about him. They mainly don't want Zenobi to get away. And so Verdin keeps Zenobi from getting away. It would have been, I think, one turn more if he'd been dashing to be able to leave. But Zenobi has to turn and fight. And so what I describe is that as Zenobi turns, he sees Verdin, knows that what is going on here, and basically just dives straight at Verdin. And of course, he does manage to hit, because that's what the dramatic thing is here. And I'm not saying just because I fudged the dice, I didn't. He actually hit. And it turned out to be very dramatic, though, because even though Verdin is able to stop him from running, Zenobi turns and basically just dives with his, I think, short swords out into Verdin's chest, like dropping Verdin, and Verdin is now down, and Zenobi turns to leave again. And at this point, if I remember correctly, I think Watna has his crossbow out, and he gets like lined up and manages, just like with his last shot, really the last shot they were going to have, manages to shoot Zenobi out of the air. And so Zenobi falls into the water dead. So at this point, Zenobi is dead. I believe Mirix realizes that he is not in a good position, and he surrenders soon after. However, before we even get to that, I had described at the end of the last session that there is another galley, a Vellecan galley, approaching on a collision course about to ram the ship they're on. And at some point during this combat, I describe how the players, near the end of the combat, I think near this point where Zenobi was getting killed, the players realize that they're about to get rammed. And I describe how it's getting closer and closer. And then I sort of I had left this as a suspenseful thing, and obviously the players didn't know if I was going to actually have it ram the ship or not, but that was never the plan. And so I describe as all of a sudden they hear like a battle cry, or like a cry of success, or I don't know what you would call it, of exhilaration. And they, one of them is able to look over the edge of the boat and see that pulling up alongside them is another galley, literally about to block the path of the oncoming one. And before they can even really like see why this boat is doing this, the boat manages to barely cut off this other galley, and bam, the galleys collide, both basically cracking under that collision. And so now both of these Vellecan galleys are sinking. And now the players get a chance to see that on board, piloting this ship that had just saved the ship they're on, is actually one of their crew members, one of their minor officers. I think I made this guy up on the spot, or I took him from the list of minor officers I'd come up with. But I was like, you know what type of ancestry don't we have represented? I was like, you know what, this is an orc, why not? And so I was like, this is the orcish minor officer Vellecan, right? And I was like, oh yeah, you guys know Vellecan is a good warrior, and now he's the one piloting the ship, and he waves up to them, and basically is like, how you doing, Captain, right? And just like kind of like, normal banter that you might hear in an action movie between heroes. And so the idea is that this NPC on their side has actually managed to commandeer this other vessel, and now both of these galleys are sinking, but a good part of their crew is on this vessel with Vellecan, who took temporary leadership of this group, and now they are clambering on aboard the big ship. And now, if it was maybe a little bit of a rough situation before with the elves and the Vellecans and the small group of the crew here, now their group of crew is much larger than the other factions. And obviously, a lot of their crew is probably on the other ships that are now, some of which are disengaging, some of which are sinking, right? They're still losing a lot of their crew. But a good chunk is now with them from this daring maneuver that Vellecan pulled off. And I'm glad that I did this with like just a random NPC from the character who I gave a name, right? Because now they, since then, just to give you guys a heads up, Vellecan has become sort of like, if they're going to give control of the ship to someone on the crew, they normally give it to Vellecan, because they're like, oh yeah, he's well known and that was a respectable move. He's earned the characters and the players' trust after this, which I think is kind of cool. I didn't really intend for that. I just, but I think it worked that way. And so they now basically wrap up the combat. Mirix essentially surrenders. I think they had to like force him to surrender. Like he kept fighting for a second, but they made it very clear they didn't want to kill him, and eventually he surrendered. At this point, the combat is over. So the players basically, the rest of the session was kind of spent just kind of going over what logistically does their situation look like and what is their surroundings. They really haven't had a lot of time to take everything in, right? And it was a long combat. It was like, I think 2 hours of combat or something like that, right? Fairly complex. And so they decide a few things, and I'll kind of go through these, maybe not in the order that they happened, but essentially they talk to Mirix, and there's a few Vellecan soldiers that were still alive as well. They recruit a few of the Vellecan soldiers, and then they basically send the Vellecan soldiers and Mirix's crew to the nearby shoreline. I had described last session, in the last campaign diary, that they had seen, when they'd been brought above decks for this dinner, that there is mainland nearby, and they don't know this, but it's part of the Tiberian coastline. I think they do know this, actually, just by deduction. And so they send the prisoners ashore, basically, except for a few that join them. They send the prisoners ashore in two groups so they don't fight, and they basically just say, here you go. One thing that was pretty interesting about this is that Mirix was especially angry with the players because he had recovered part of his payment for helping eliminate Bort the Butcher, is that he was promised control of this elven artifact that the players had found called the Eye of the East. And I based it off of a item, I think it's called a Sentinel Shield, right? But I gave it some special other things too. And it's essentially an elven artifact based off of a normal item that has some history for the elves. And the players had found this in the fort, brought it up with them, and then they had seen it be given to Mirix. So Mirix now asked them, like, could you at least give me this artifact? And to my surprise, this is a group of like pirates, and they've been playing that pretty well. But they also realize that having enemies that aren't so angry at you, making making up with your enemies can have benefits. Having more friends can have benefits. And so to my surprise, to some extent, Nihilus, the captain, decides that they're going to give this elven shield back to these elves. And so Mirix is sent ashore without a boat, obviously, right? But he does have this artifact, and that will have consequences for the players in a positive way. So I think it was an interesting decision. Meanwhile, they try to figure out what they want to do with Zenobi. Zenobi's body fell in the water and sank, but they know that he has an artifact on his back, like attached to his armor. And so they don't really, these little hatches that basically erupt into these wings. Hatches wouldn't be a good word, but yeah, these little buckles almost. And it's a magically attached artifact to armor that Zenobi was wearing. They decide that they're not going to worry about it right now. They decide that Drake's character Nihilus, his backstory deals with a antiquarian guild, and he says, oh, it's okay, I will tell my guild and they can come get it because they are closer to here than where we're going, and we shouldn't bother with this right now. We should get out of here, which I think does make sense. And so they decide to leave Zenobi's body. The one other thing they do before they start heading out of here is they elect a new leader. I went over this in a previous campaign diary, in the last one. But essentially the way that the crew works, and they haven't had to do this in a long time since Abort the Butcher had been the leader of the crew for a long time. But essentially, if there's a reason why the captain can't be captain or is killed or anything else like that, the first mate takes over until danger is out of the way, so until now in this situation, and then the whole crew votes on a new leader. And in this case, and it's mostly a formality, I describe how most of the time the first mate is almost always elected in these types of systems, but it's a formality, right? And it lends the idea, the perception of honor and lawfulness to the whole proceeding, right? To the whole succession. And so I tell them that they have this election. I describe this election. I describe how in the course of voting, the vast majority of the crew votes for Drake's character Nihilus, who was the first mate. But I do describe how like a few people vote for Vellecan, actually, out of respect for what Vellecan just did. He basically did rescue like over half the crew just now and brought them back together. And so I describe how obviously these people realized that Vellecan wasn't going to win the election, but I describe how they, as a sign of respect, give these, not protest votes, but because it's, it's not that they don't like the captain, but these votes of respect to Vellecan, saying like he has gone up in the rankings of the crew, right? In the rankings of respect, which I think was something I came up with on the spot, but I think, again, kind of lends credence to the idea that this crew does have perceptions of the leadership. So at this point, the crew has elected a new leader. They've gotten out of immediate danger. And now they have to decide where do they want to go. They kind of debate a few different courses of option, and literal courses, I guess, since they're at sea. Some of them say that they should go straight to the Lady of the Vine, the woman who had given Cyrus his medallion, and she had told them, literally, before helping them get through part of the fort before, she had told them, if you ever need work, I could have work for you. And they're like, well, she already helped us multiple times now, we should go to her. And I think that was kind of what I wanted them to think, is like, I wanted to seed the idea that this is obviously a sandbox campaign. They could go literally anywhere, and I would have stuff prepared, or at least the start of things, seeds here and there, right? I have ideas for different adventures and stuff seeded throughout the world. But I did have kind of this particular thing with the Lady of the Vine seeded a little more strongly in their minds, right? And that was kind of the idea. I wanted to make sure that they had something to go after if they had nothing else that they found, right? And so that did surprise me that came up as an option. Some of them said that they should just go to the nearest city first and then figure out what to do. And this is actually what they ended up doing. They were also considering going to Centricion, which is a little further, but is where Nihilus's guild is, and it's a big city where they could regroup. But they actually decided to go to just the nearest large city that isn't Vellecan controlled. It's a city called Petrodonia. It's a Greek-inspired city in the Tiberian Isles on a decent-sized island that is not too far, but a little bit in the wrong direction. They decide they'll go here, though, because it has it's renowned for metalworking. It has a decent-sized shipyard where they could get repairs done. And it is it's known for being an exporter of metals to the dwarves of the Middlesea. But one of the reasons they go there is because Watna, who is Jack's artificer, who's also the shipwright of the ship's crew, he actually lived there for a couple decades, and so they have knowledge of this place. And so they go there with the idea being that they're going to get supplies, get more crew, and then go back the other direction to meet the Lady of the Vine once again. As they start to get going here, I actually had the players roll for a random encounter. I decided, you know what, this is a good time to roll for a random encounter. Normally for me, when I do random encounters, I have the players roll 2 dice. One of them is for whether or not there will be a random encounter, right? The first one determines that, and it differs, the number to beat or not beat, right? Depends on where they are. How likely I want a encounter to be. And then if they get an encounter, then they roll on a different table, which has a bunch of different options of what they might run into. And so they actually did roll unluckily and got a random encounter here. This was near the end of the session, so I didn't really want to have combat. But I had an idea based on what they rolled. The roll that they rolled on the random encounter table was a sea serpent. And obviously I wasn't going to throw a sea serpent at them right now. So I decided, here's what I'm going to do. I did include the sea serpent, but in a bit of a different way. As they're sailing, I describe how the alarm is raised because up ahead they see a floating corpse. And as they get closer, they realize that it's the corpse of a large sea serpent. Right? Just washed, or not washed up yet, but just being tossed around by the waves. And I describe how they're out of curiosity, they pull up next to it. And being how players in D&D are, they decide they want to try to harvest part of its body. They essentially get a dinghy out, tie the dinghy to the main boat and then tie the dinghy to the corpse so they can keep sailing and get to work while they're going. And essentially they get their surgeon to just go in there with a couple of assistants and start hacking away at this thing, right? Which I thought was really funny. But it makes sense. If there's a rare creature like a sea serpent just lying around, obviously you should try to harvest stuff from it. And they managed to collect some things. They managed to get some teeth from it, some scales, and even an egg, an unborn egg, unegged egg. I don't know if sea serpents have live birth or nests, but they find an egg inside of the corpse, and they take the egg basically because they're like, well, if it's still alive, maybe we could sell it or keep it or something. Right, and so this is a pretty interesting set of things. However, they also basically decided that they just want to take the serpent's entire head. So essentially, they spend I described that their crew spends hours just sawing away at the neck of this thing, and they take the whole serpent's head, bring it on board, and then let the rest go. And we'll talk about how they use this in the next couple sessions, but they basically bring aboard the whole Serpent's head, and it will become a centerpiece of the campaign soon. You'll see what I mean. But that's about where we ended. They had got some loot from this little random encounter. It wasn't combat, but it still spiced things up, and it's an organic moment that, as you'll see, will lead to interesting development of the crew later, and we'll talk about that more in the future. But that's about where we ended, and that's where we're going to wrap up this campaign diary. I think it went a little longer than I expected, actually. But yeah, we ended with them essentially arriving to the decent-sized city of Petradonia on the island of the same name. And in the next video, we'll go over what they find, but suffice it to say, it turns out to be a little more than just a quick supply stop and turns into a couple session long detour, and we'll get into what that means next time. But I think this is where it gets particularly interesting, and I think this next session is where I'll really be able to get into more of like the bread and butter of what I think is going to make this campaign really fun. So yeah, that's going to do it here. Thanks for watching. If you did like it, feel free to leave a like and subscribe. These haven't gotten a ton of views, but I think some people have enjoyed it, so I hope you continue to enjoy it. And I will see you next time. Bye-bye.